We will have the panel discussion, and the participants are Anna is a chief specialist, Anna Rotkirch. Then previously already we met Professor Wolfgang Lutz and Dr. Elena Rovenskaya, as well as Professor Axel Börs-Suppan. And then we will have also Professor Maria Jylhä participating in the panel.
Okay, I'm Wolfgang Lutz. I'm a demographer here in Vienna at IASA, this International Institute, but also the Austrian Academy of Sciences. I'm leading the Vienna Institute of Demography, and we are just building up a new department of demography at the University of Vienna. I've been working on multidimensional population modeling, so not just focusing on the age composition, but also the educational or labor force participation, place of residence, and all these human characteristics that matter in terms of changing composition of the population.
Okay, good afternoon once more. Axel Börs-Suppan. I'm an economist at Munich, Germany, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm working on the economics of aging, particularly health policies and pension policies. I'm quite interested in Finland. It's a very interesting, small but very interesting country. Different from Sweden and Denmark, very different from the south of Europe. Yeah, I'm the principal investigator of SHARE, which is data set on health, social situation, and the economic situation. And I've been quite pleased that part of the years of good life, which Wolfgang and his crew have measured, is actually based on the SHARE data. And I hope this will also be the case in Finland.
Good afternoon, also from my side. My name is Elena Rovenskaya. I come from IASA as well as Wolfgang, Austria, near Vienna. Among many things, what I'm doing, I'm trying to advance formal methods for infusing system thinking into policy support. And what I presented in the session that we just had before was how to bring together different elements of well-being and how to connect them by causal relationships based on evidence and what usefulness it may have for public policy planning.
Thank you and welcome. And then could we have Professor Maria Jylhä?
So my name is Maria Jylhä. I'm professor of gerontology at Tampere University and Gerontology Research Center. I'm also a team leader in the Academy of Finland funded Center of Excellence for Aging and Care. I've been working for, 40 years in studies, in population studies on functioning, well-being, health and longevity. And then I'm also the chairing the scientific panel that works together with Anna Rotkirch in this project.
So I am Anna Rotkirch. My background is in family studies, but now currently since May I am at the Prime Minister's office thinking about what modern population policies could look like for Finland. And actually I'm also with Mika Mäki running SHARE Finland. I really liked Axel's talk about the need for proper data, and we could now see how good it was to have Finland, because now we can brag about this achievement in actually lowering loneliness during lockdown.
To kick off this panel, I would like to ask the first question, and I invite the audience also to think about questions for the panelists. My question is that if we agree all that the aging is it is a problem for public finances, what do you think would be the most important action to improve the demographic situation in Finland? And now we're talking about Finland, that you all know quite well. So what should we do to improve our demographic situation? And this is a question to everyone.
Let me actually be right away provocative. I don't think one should not address the population. The population is what it is. The politicians should react by improving the pension system, improving the healthcare system, but the population is what they are. And in that sense, aging is not a problem at all. What can be a problem if we live longer what can be a problem if people get their kids they want to. So demography is not a problem, but the policies which we have, they may be a problem. They can be changed.
I could not agree more with Professor Supan. I think it's a very strange idea that we would see that our longer lives are a problem. Of course, we would try to deliver cigarettes on a square and take out all the blood pressure medication, and so we would get rid of the problem of longer lives. But I don't think that's a social policy that can be recommended. So I also think that the question is, what are we doing with the population we have? And how could we start to think of the population aging not as an external threat that is a threat for the real society, but understand that the aging of the population is a transformation of the society itself. And you said that we will talk about the policies later, so I don't go into that. I think we should be happy that we have longer lives and we can live to see our children, of our grandchildren.
I will also be a bit provocative. I agree that the demographic structure in itself is an outcome of our science and longevity, and and human rights and sexual rights, and there is cause for celebration there. We also know that globally there is an unmet need for contraception, and it's very important to act there in order to help women and families meet the need for improve sexual and gender rights, and that would actually help us meet the end of global population growth sooner. However, in Finland, there is actually an unmet need for childbearing. Finns in general wish to have 2 children. And if we now look at the scenarios we have for how many children this young generation will have, it varies between 1 to 4 and 1 to 6, maybe 1 to 8 per children. So there's a gap in the other direction. We also know that in the Nordic countries, it's especially those who have many resources who can implement, who can have the amount of children they want to have. And this is especially true for men, but also for women. So I will provocatively now say, I think most of the policies we do are demographic policies. If we encourage people to study, if we encourage people to work, that is demographic and population policies. And if we support people to have the number of children they want to have, that is also demographic policies. And I see no problem in trying to be more proactive and signaling the values of our society in all these life spheres.
I just have to mention my colleague Lina Ilmala is also commenting now on the chat, and she actually took my comment that I wanted to make, so she just said it, but I want to develop it maybe a little bit more. So we have really a feedback loop here in the spirit of this systems thinking that I showed before, right? So on the one hand, there is a trade-off between costs to the government in terms of supporting childbearing and in terms of supporting elderly people. Yeah, so there is a clear trade-off. So one solution that one can see there is that obviously if you reduce one cost, you can increase the other. Yeah, so can we reduce the costs on the elderly people such that there would be more support and more, even indirectly, it doesn't have to be a material support provided to families to motivate them to have children. That's not what I'm saying, but to provide childcare, to provide flexible working hours, all that eventually requires some finances. So again, coming back to what I was trying to say in my intervention earlier, so social system can be a source of such policies. For example, so if people who retire have an opportunity to contribute to the society beyond their retirement in different ways, not only the society can benefit from that already reduces the cost, but there is another very important feedback. So they increase the meaningfulness of life, and through that they themselves feel better, and through that they themselves need a little bit less costs for the government to health things and so on. So there is a lot of evidence showing that there is a positive correlation between meaningfulness of life and healthy life. And so that can really be one source of, to your question, what can be one policy? That can be, for example, something to explore.
I mean, I think we have to be conscious of what we mean by population and demography. As I tried to explain during my presentation, it is more than what is conventionally thought of the number of people and their age structure. That is indeed largely a given, and only migration is the policy variable. That's where governments can decide how many people do they let into the country, and not always. If the refugees just come, there's also a limit to the political structure. But otherwise, if we have a broader definition of population, as I said, and demography's original definition is about changing population structures in the plural, which includes the health distribution in the population, it includes the education and skills and other individual characteristics. And there, of course, is a lot of room for policies for influencing the health status and also the education. And I just wanted to, in addition, bring in what I call sort of a life course perspective. There's so much evidence that the health status at the age of 80 depends on what the person has experienced 70 or 75 years or even 80 years before. It's the early childhood socialization, early childhood development that predetermines so much what happens later in life. And that in Finland, very nice neovola system where you really not only a medical treatment of the babies, but also the social work, development, psychology, and so on. And that really assists the cognitive development of children. Actually, my hypothesis is that Finland is not doing particularly well in the PISA studies because the school system is so good, but maybe because of your neovola system, where early on in life, the cognitive abilities are strengthened. And the distribution is very important here. You should not only look at the average, but Axel has very clearly shown that there is an issue that the younger cohorts maybe have a higher proportion of being in bad health. But this proportion, if I remember the graph right, was increasing from 4% to 5%. There are in all societies these marginal groups, these people who are not benefiting from progress as much, and there needs to be a targeted focus on this. In Finnish, you call them the syrjäytyneitä. They are really people, and they are a relatively high proportion, possibly, I don't have the data, bigger in Finland than in some other Western European countries. And there needs to be a special emphasis on not just looking at how the mean is doing, but a focus on people in special need, because it's not only bad for themselves, it's also a burden on society to have to pay all the social benefits to them.
It seems that we have a kind of a problem here because we have a high work satisfaction, as we saw earlier in Axel's presentation, that in Finland the work satisfaction is high, but still we retire very early. Our average retirement age is quite low. So what can we do about this so that we could get the working life more flexible and extend the working life of elderly people? Because I know, like my mother-in-law, she's like 83 actually, and still she goes fishing and chops the wood and go picks berries and all she eats is basically from her garden and from the lake. So and she's very active and she could do many other things, but she loves what she's doing. But how could we extend this work satisfaction from the like my age to these maybe 70s, maybe not all the way to 80 years, but still?
One thing is, of course, pension reform, and that has been in the making in Finland, trial and error in making the transition from work to retirement more flexible. So most people don't. They want to go slower when they get older. Employers have a tendency not to allow them, so they like having people work full speed and then go to zero. That may be efficient for a company. I'm actually not so sure that is the case, but that is what's claimed. But it's definitely bad for people because people want a transition. Now that transition has to be engineered in terms of pension rules very, very carefully. And Finland has done some bad steps 20 years ago when they started this line of reasoning, but they have learned a lot. And I think it can be further improved by having people working only half. There is a deeper problem, actually, which has not only to do with older workers, but also with workers with families. Many of them also want to work maybe 70% or 75%, but not 100%. So society has to learn to have more part-time, more flexibility. And I think that would be my number one necessary change in the labor market.
Yes, I certainly am not an expert in this, and that is why I can talk with strong certainty. So I'm sure there are many, many things that could be done. I'm taking up just a few. One is that the working life in Finland is not very flexible. Many people say that in Finland you work at a 100% efficiency, or then you. And I know that in many other countries this is a little bit more smooth. The other thing is that there are clear prejudice among the employers against older workers, and that has been much discussed recently. Very strange that we were thinking that someone aged 55 would be an old worker when she's supposed to be living until 90. And the third one perhaps is that, which is a very minor one, is that then we prevent some people or reasonable number of people from working as long as they would like to do. That's my personal experience. The university professor needs to retire at 68 or younger. Well, which means that you might have 15 productive years that if you were, for instance, the university professor in the US, you would go on. In Finland, no.
What can the policymakers do now then? Do we have some urgent pension reform coming along, or?
We should not forget that we have changed our pension system, and our legal pension age is increasing all the time. So that big reform has already been done.
It's really flexibility on the labor market, which is the key issue. Of course, mandatory retirement is not the appropriate policy in a modern society. So, and amazingly, mandatory retirement is particularly frequent in the government sector. So it's not only professors, but it's in the government sector in general. So they could go and be the first example how to actually maintain labor force, given part-time, and be an example for the rest of the economy.
Yeah, I just want to very much agree with what was just said. This flexibility in both working and retirement, I think, is extremely important, both for working people to be able to work part-time. And now with COVID, we have this new experience, or new to many people, that not only flexibility in part-time, but also where and when to work. Yeah, so if you, now we are all connecting, or most of us, I guess, from home. I connect from home. So it obviously gives much more flexibility and much more possibilities to combine different roles. So that's all clear. And of course, also one see challenges on that front for sure. But somehow reconciliation of this, I think, would be really indeed a very, very big advance there. One aspect here, I'm not familiar with Finnish situation in that, but in Austria, for example, there is this notion of early retirement. So not only people are not encouraged to work more, but it's the opposite. So the government can provide some incentives to companies to send people in pension earlier than they should. So that's the opposite, completely opposite trend. And that, of course, indeed, especially, for example, when it's applied to scientists who are at age of 55 or 60, are very productive, but they are kind of asked to use this system, is a little bit strange in the current time. So maybe one can, again, is kind of provocative statement to make, one can revert such a system and have a system of later retirement, and government supporting that somehow. One reason why maybe this early retirement is being done, for example, in Austria, maybe this is because there is this concern of limited career opportunities for young people. So this is one kind of narrative, right? That you have to send people to pension such that the new generation can make faster the careers, and that motivates them and so on. So if that is the case, so of course one can think of some kind of ways of fixing this. Yeah, so you can still have plans or career development programs and all that, and somehow have this sort of other roles that the retired people or those who should retire but they don't want to retire, that they play kind of complementary to the younger labor force. So maybe this kind of richer roles in companies or in private sector or in public sector, so that can reduce this kind of fears and therefore can also address this problem.
Yes, so one reason we originally wanted to conduct SHARE in Finland was to understand why so many Finns stop working even before the formal retirement age. And as Jelena said, we have had some policies which actually encourage employers to send people off earlier. Those are now being or have been removed by the government, quite rightly so, I think. But there is also something in the attitude and also in the workplace climate, since our data show that if we compare Finland to both Estonia and Sweden, and then you ask people, do you want to retire earlier, or as early as, and how do you feel about your current workplace? How at ease and welcome do you feel there? In both of these questions, Finland scores way worse than both Sweden and Estonia, which I found quite shocking, and I think it's something we really need to work with. So it's the attitude to flexibility, but maybe also just some higher stress levels and performance requirements in Finnish workplaces. And then the second thing we have been discussing in the scientific panel really much is this idea about lifelong learning. Now Finland is kind of moving towards developing an ecosystem for lifelong learning. And one thing which is quite clear to me at this stage is that it cannot stop at 65. It really has to be from the cradle to the grave. And you should really include also those not in the workforce formally or informally into incentives of learning and education and all these kinds of supportive systems.
Yeah, let me pick up a few things which have been said before and sort of undermine them with a little bit more evidence. Elena, I think, put the finger in the worst kind of misunderstanding how economics works, that the old people have to make place for the young people. That's just plain wrong. If this would have been the case, anybody is crowding out the other person. And the worst are, if I now look at our participants of the panel, is women. They took all the work away from men. That's why men are now all unemployed, right? Or wrong? Well, obviously wrong, right? So the economies could actually employ could employ a lot more women, and without doing any damage or to the men. And the same holds obviously for old and young people. And one has to repeat this over and again. This is just another form of prejudices against older people, but has nothing to do with reality and with economics. So that's one point. The other point is, which is very often mentioned, particularly in Austria, if I may pick up my dear neighboring country here, is that older workers are just too sick to work. They're ill and they just can't do it anymore. Well, we have seen this is just not the case. Health changes very little between 60 and 67 or whatever the new retirement ages are. People, of course, get older and sicker, but much later than that. So again, the evidence just disproves it. There are many people who are not that well in terms of health, but they have been already doing badly in the 50s. So it's the heterogeneity of people and not the age per se. And the third one, which is also reiterated, even though it's wrong, is that older people are less productive. Now, if that is actually the case in a very narrow sense of productivity. Now, unfortunately, some people know me. I love the mountains. I'm not that fast as I used to be. So my productivity in running up a mountain is definitely lower than it was at 50. Does that matter for my job? No. If you now go to a standard industrial worker, what these people are doing is very much managed in a way that it doesn't matter whether they're 65 or 55. They keep the same kind of productivity. They have more experience. Maybe they're less agile with their fingers, but they know much better what can go wrong, what can go better. So all the studies which carefully measure productivity show that productivity essentially stays flat. There's no reason to throw them out. And I think going against these three prejudices, crowding out, being unhealthy, being unproductive, that is really important to create a healthy society which is aging.
Yes, just one more comment. We were talking about the flexibility and particularly flexible retirement age. And in all this discussion, I think it's important to remember that it is not the same to all social classes and to all professions. It's usually for instance, the flexible retirement ages, they help more people who are more well off and are healthier and will then have higher pensions anyway. So there are many things to have a closer look before doing any decisions, any political nationwide decisions on these.
So we have been talking about the kind of the end of the life cycle now, but let's go to the beginning of the life cycle and the babies. My first question about this is that is there an optimal fertility rate? What should it be like in Finland? With what kind of fertility rate? I know that there is a link between the education and the fertility, but still, do you have any kind of idea what would be the perfect or optimal fertility rate for us in Finland?
Well, if I can try to address this question, since I've published several papers on this where we did all kinds of simulations, and the outcome really depends on what you consider in these simulations as criterion variables. The bottom line is that however you put it, typically a fertility that is somewhat below the so-called replacement level of 2.0, surviving children, or 2.1 if you factor in child mortality, which is really a highly artificial number that nobody should really take as an aim, or so many people think that's the natural aim. What our simulations have shown, where we take sort of this education weighted dependency ratio or other such outcome variables as the criteria, is that somewhere between a cohort fertility, we are not talking about the short-term fluctuations now, where you have tempo distortions and sometimes the fertility in 1 year falls below 1.5 and then it's above again, but it's sort of the smooth cohort level. It is somewhere between 1.5 and 1.8 is probably what is optimal. Why is it less than 2? Well, because there can be more investment in each child that later on pays off in terms of higher skill and higher contribution to society. What we've also done is try to factor in environmental issues such as climate change or loss in biodiversity. And there it's a matter of fact that under current consumption patterns where we are not yet climate neutral, every additional human being has an additional ecological footprint, something that we take away from the future generations. And depending on how much weight you give to this, the optimal fertility really comes further down. There will be maybe a higher cost in terms of the cost of aging, but a lower cost in terms of impact on the natural environment. So these are difficult trade-offs there. But in short, I think there's nothing wrong with moderately low fertility. If it's very low, like we have in South Korea, where it's clearly below 1 child per woman on average, then I think there are all kinds of issues come up in terms of discontinuities within families. I mean, family trees soon dying out, and also each generation is only replaced by a half-sized generation that you bring some breaks, but somewhere with around 1.5 to 1.8, and often, of course, this is complemented by immigrants, and we can talk about immigration later, which is a very, very hot political topic, but most countries do receive some immigrants. The worst is with countries in Eastern Europe, like Serbia or Bulgaria, Romania. They are not only have very low fertility, but they lose a lot of people throughout migration, and this is selective. They lose the best educated. So these countries are indeed in deep trouble.
Yes, I fully agree with Wolfgang, but I wanted to add that especially in Finland, whenever we talk about fertility, we always approach the optimal question from the point of view of economics and population structure. So therefore I wanted to say that optimally from the point of view of population well-being and happiness should be to help as many as we can to have the number of children they wish to have. And of course that is not always possible, but at the moment of those Finns who really say they intend to have a child, less than half will succeed within 2 years. So it's really like a tricky road, even when you want to have a child, not to speak about all those who are ambivalent or looking for a partner. And here I think the huge transformation in working life, in our life plans, should involve more fertility awareness and teaching about it, teaching young people that if you want to combine studies and work and self-development with parenting, these are different ways of how you can think about this and do this in order to kind of lower the threshold from wish to having a child.
Are there any proven policy measures that can encourage family life and increase the fertility rate?
I mean, there is all kinds of experiments going on over the last 50 years, I would say, in Europe. And the interesting thing is that under totalitarian regimes, like we had it in Eastern Europe until 1990, actually the birth rates were higher. In some cases, through rather what we would say positive means for women to combine being a mother and working, much better childcare facilities than in most Western countries, with maybe the exception of France. And in some cases, for instance, there's a very interesting experiment, natural experiment between East and West Germany at the time. They used to have the same fertility levels, and then in the 1970s, they simultaneously started to go down quite steeply. And in the West, it continued to go down. And in the Eastern German government did something rather radical that brought the fertility rates up again to the previous level of almost 2. And what they did is that they gave every pregnant woman, whether married or not, access to an apartment. And this was in a time where it was almost impossible for young people to get an apartment in Eastern Germany. So that is how this still prevalent pattern today in Eastern Germany, that women get children rather young, typically only one child, and often not being married yet. So this has sort of established a new behavioral pattern, and that at least for some time brought up fertility. And then, of course, after 1990, the rate declined even steeper. And then sort of in the Western European context, we have essentially 2 different regimes since the 19th century, an explicitly pronatalist policy with all kinds of really massive financial redistribution, where you have the family splitting, where children are taken into account when your tax is being calculated. So a millionaire with 4 or 5 children in France used to pay almost no taxes because his income was divided by the number of children. This has been a little changed over the past years, but it's still very much in the mind of people that one child is for mother, one child is for father, and the third child is for La République. So this is for the population. And then in the Nordic countries, it also until recently used to have rather high fertility levels without being explicitly pronatalist, but there it was the good compatibility between work and family through childcare facilities, parental leave arrangement, and so on. They were running under the label of women's rights and equal opportunities, but they also had this birth-enhancing effect. But evidently, something seems to be changing, at least in Finland at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. I would imagine it would be very expensive to give an apartment to every pregnant women in Finland. But what about Anna? Do you have any, let's say, more inexpensive solutions?
We will propose things in the report, but I maybe would here like to stress more generally the point that I really think we need to, just as we rethink work, we need to rethink the combination of work and family. And that has been maybe one of the main reasons of this shock to Finnish fertility recently, that we have this, in a very good way, young people have the possibility to work and travel and explore and study, but some combined with quite a weak signal about the values of family formation, maybe. Or just that we have to find new and different ways to combine things. I mean, and not absolutely not maybe go into this that everybody should have children, but more enabling and empowering people to think these things through. Because we do know that many, not all, but many feel great ambivalence and some kind of anxiety of even thinking about having a child.
Maybe lastly, we could talk about the issue that Wolfgang already mentioned, the immigration or migration issue, because now we have a depopulation in the West and still overpopulation in some developing countries, and it is creating tensions. So how do you see migration as a solution to Western world's demographic problems?
This is just a question of numbers. If you want to change the population structure by age, just count the number of baby boomers and offset them by young people coming from, I don't know where from. And you see this is completely illusionary. No, this is, each country has to solve the demographic problems herself. Migration helps a little bit, particularly educated migration, but it's a drop in the bucket.
Over the last years, there's a major study with the European Commission doing different scenarios of different immigration patterns for all the member countries of the European Union, and plus a few Eastern European countries, and playing with different volume, but also the different qualification profiles. And there it's very clear the better educated the migrants are, the more beneficial it is for the migrants themselves. They just have a steeper learning curve, more quickly integrating into the new home country. Yes, and then of course the cultural difference, so to say, makes a difference. So people who are from nearby cultures and the other European countries find it easier to integrate. So it's really that the successful integration must be the criterion of how many people are let into the country, because we see this in many countries where integration did not work well, and then it really becomes a burden for society, and it is even disruptive for social cohesion, and all this talk about parallel societies. Not even talking about what we're currently seeing in France, a really sort of quite militant discussion about this issue related to Islamists. In a way, I agree with the wording that Axel just used. That yes, it can make some contribution. There are some countries, I mean, Canada is the example where they really have very large numbers of immigrants, but they select them all. They have very few asylum seekers. And that is another problem in Europe, where the immigration debate is largely dominated by a discussion about asylum seekers, which is a very different kind of migration. Theoretically, we are giving temporary protection against persecution, but de facto, of course, many of these people stay around and actually in many countries dominate. They are the dominant source of immigration, whereas the targeted and planned labor migration is clearly, from an economic perspective, desirable. And then, of course, there's also family reunification. And there again, it makes a difference whether the women who also come typically with the men are also educated enough and speak the language and can enter the labor force. So integration really becomes the key. And then This needs to be assessed in every specific country context, and countries come to very, very different solutions. As you know, Japan and South Korea are they're most rapidly aging, but they take virtually no migrants on board. They rather build robots looking after washing the old people than having nurses imported from the Philippines or wherever. They have a few now, but it's still very small numbers. In other countries, in Italy, they just really don't control the borders too much, and they have a lot of uneducated migrants, mostly undocumented migrants. So it is a hot political potato, and one just needs to find a viable solution that society can digest. And it clearly, so to say, if we have a problem of aging, this issue, but it can contribute to fill certain gaps on the labor markets that we have for certain skills and whatever.
Yeah, if we are trying to find sort of the rapid solution for the aging population, of course, bringing in many young migrants would change the population structure a little bit. But then the problem with those migrants is that they also are humans and they also age. So that's the process is still going on. But I personally, I think that we would need and we should take more migrants, but that is not because of our population structure, but because we are living in a common world, and it's very selfish to have such a protective policy as Finland has now.
Just to comment, because in Finland the migration discussion is also dominated by the refugees, but in Finland the vast majority of immigrants are due to, it's almost half and half now, work-related immigration or marital migration. So I mean the international immigration. So in that sense, we don't have so many refugees. But what is really interesting is that I think in Finland, many political groups see immigration as the solution, or in a way, you have all these people who say, why should we have children? There are enough of people anyway. Or who say that, yes, you know, we don't need to discuss demography much because we can just have more immigrants. And they bypass these problems you raised so well. Immigrants also age. They are not economically always kind of contributing at the start, and so on. And then, of course, we have the big party who's almost fully opposed to more international immigration. So I thank you for your more both skeptical but also provocative and more realistic approaches to immigration as a solution.
There was one comment on the chat about the part-time work, that like in Finland the share of part-time work is rather low still. Could that solve some part of the problem, that we could encourage more part-time work for the, let's say, like students, also in the midlife people, and also for the pensioners to work part-time more? What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, we talked about that earlier. I think that's very important. Let's again look at data. It's if you ask people, and here I don't know the Finnish situation, but I know it in France and in Germany. If you ask people around age 60 when they want to retire, they say very soon. If you ask them once they're retired, whether it was good that they're retired, they say no. Had I known how retirement is, I would have worked a little bit longer. So this tells you the ambivalence people have. They want to enjoy life. They want to have more time for their grandkids or whatever hobbies. They're bored with their job, but they don't want to be thrown out completely. So it's this more flexible transition with part-time jobs. Part-time jobs are essential for that. Is the way to go, and I think it needs examples, and it's so shameful that the government proceeds with the worst of all examples, allowing very little part-time typically, and throwing out people rather early with mandatory retirement age. So I know that the state secretary has left, but say hello to him, please, and he should heed that advice, please.
Now we have two comments. First Maria, and then Wolfgang, and then I think we have to wrap up this discussion.
I think the part-time job is part of the flexibility package that we talked about, and it may be very well as long as it does not lead to poverty, as long as people can live for their salaries and it doesn't make their pensions impossibly small, which also is a possibility. So always you should see what are the social political consequences of the solutions.
Yes, I actually wanted to also make a related point. Axel, I fully agree when it comes to the part-time at the end on the transition to retirement. But the way I understood the question before was also part-time for young parents who sort of work only 75 or 50%. And here it really depends on the conditions under which they take such part-time. For instance, in Austria, the trade union is very strongly against female part-time work when they should all work full-time, because they see this as a main reason then for poverty among the retired women, because typically if a couple has a child or two children, then the female salary in Austria still is a bit lower than the male, so it makes more sense for the woman to go part-time, and then these contributions to her pension are later missing. So it would be necessary that the government also picks up for a certain number of years the full pension contribution so that he or she doesn't lose out too much. So that is again part of a package of flexibility between work. We could also see that you maybe early consume some of your pension entitlements already when you are in the so-called rush hour of life with your young children, but this is not later then used against your pension entitlement.
Somebody has to pay, right? I should leave the answer to Anna. Why couldn't the men work a little shorter as well? There doesn't have to be an imbalance. There's an equilibration mechanism between the two in the partnership. It doesn't have to be negative for the women. So there are many more fundamental issues in the relation between men and women which could solve that problem, and they're not primarily pension problems.
This is a huge challenge topic for our next panel. But in Finland, the men who work the longest hours are the men who have family and small children. So in a way, probably the men who maybe for many reasons could work a bit less, whereas large groups of men work very little, if at all, and these are the syrjäytyneet at different age stages. So this is a huge puzzle to show how to make kind of fathers maybe take more of the paternal leaves. I was shocked by the number that 1/4 take the full of the dad leaves that we have. So even those are specifically for fathers, well compensated, are not used at the moment. So this is a big challenge for family policies. And on the other hand, we have the many men who would need more support, more education, more labor market flexibility to become employed at other stages. So yes, many things to solve there. And I don't have the answers now.
Would like to draw attention to the phenomenon that we did not discuss at all, which is the longevity, that it's not only older people whose number is increasing, but we have just a new stage of life emerged, which is the very old people. And that means that the policies towards aging and old age should be more sophisticated than they have been before.
This was brilliant, Maria, to conclude with. Yes, we have this whole new stage of life emerging. Maybe I would like to stress in an optimistic and kind of explorative way that we are really, I mean, the whole of humanity is entering a new stage, and we don't know how it will go from now on, and Finland is in the forefront. I mean, so at least for us scholars, it's really exciting. I'm also kind of touched to see how many are still listening to this webinar. I had not expected that. I think we have a very high turnout rate of those who signed up. Thank you, because we at this population policy Hanke project, we wanted to make one open afternoon, and it seems it has been worthwhile since you wanted to listen to this. The recordings will be available afterwards. And for my part, this was even more interesting than I thought, and I knew it would be very interesting. Especially want to thank Wolfgang Lutz, who has been now working for Finland remotely from the early morning to now, and also the brilliant two commentators of this webinar, and then especially the invisible people who organized this all at IASA, and here in Finland, Sari Löytökorpi and Sanna Malkki, so the communications team at the Prime Minister's office, and then partly at Väestöpolitikka also, who has been working with this from June. So the thing that it went so smoothly and we could enjoy this was thanks to you, and then to the new colleagues at Kaiku Helsinki who made this happen. So thank you from my part, and let's keep optimism, because yeah, the alternatives are worse.